Good morning. I would like to welcome you at our lecture today. This lecture is in the series, All the New Questions in Jewish History. We invite prominent scholars from all over the world and ask them quite simple questions like today. But the answers are not always very obvious. Last month we had a guest from Israel, Dr. Uri Hooper, and he answered the question, who is Jewish? I hope that maybe some of you attended that lecture. Today we have a guest from Israel as well, Professor Moshe Rosman. He's a professor at the Department of Jewish History at the Bar Ilan University, and his field of research is the history of Jews in Poland, Lithuanian Commonwealth. He specializes in integrating Polish and Jewish and Polish sources, and this is very well visible in his books like Lord's Jews, the Magnate Jewish Relations in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This book you can read in Polish. Another one, book about Baal Shem Tov, founder of Hasidism, the quest for the historical Baal Shem Tov, you can buy in our bookstore in the museum. I would like to mention another book also translated into Polish, How Jewish is the Jewish History, which is a kind of analysis of historiography about Polish Jews. And for his books, Professor Rosman have won numerous prizes in the United States, in Israel, in Poland as well. His current research is on the history of the Jewish woman in pre-modern Poland. But today, Professor Rosman will talk about Hasydyzm, and we ask the question, jak narodził się Hasydyzm? The floor is yours.
Dobry wieczór, shalom, good evening. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Professor Jindul, for this generous introduction. Maybe I'll sell some books. I'm sure you all know what Hasidism is, a spiritualist, pietist, Jewish social religious movement that began in the 18th century and is usually associated mainly with the 18th century as its classic period. The founder of Hasidism was a man named Yisrael ben Eliezer Baal Shem Tov, Israel Baal Shem Tov, often called just Besht for the initials of Baal Shem Tov. And the story has been told many times about what he did and how Hasidism began. Tonight, I'm going to give you my version of the story, and you can compare it to the versions you know. So first of all, many of you may be familiar with this picture, which is often shown as a picture of Israel Baal Shem Tov. Actually, it's not. This is not our Baal Shem Tov. It is a Baal Shem Tov. It's the Baal Shem of London, whose name was Shmuel Falk, and was a younger contemporary of Israel Baal Shem Tov. But this is just a good example of confusion that has arisen as to exactly who Yisrael Baal Shem Tov was and what he did. This is the title page of one of the most important sources that we have on the development of Hasidism, a book called Shivchei Habesht, in praise of the Baal Shem Tov. It's a collection of about 200 stories about the Baal Shem Tov and his associates, much of it legendary, some of it historical. Now, in this book, there is a story, which I'll try to read in Polish. Please forgive my Chicago accent. Kiedy Beszt przybył do gmina w Międzybożu, Chasidzie, Reb Zev Kitzis i Reb David Purkis nie uznali go za ważną osobę ze względu na tytuł Beszta, które nie przystoi Sadikowa. Now, what's wrong with this story? We have the Baal Shem Tov coming to Międzybuż, a town in Ukraine, and the founder of Hasidism, number one, finds that there are already Hasidim there, and number two, they don't want to accept him. What's going on here? Well, the fact is that there is Hasidism before Hasidism. We can say Hasidism with a small ch before Hasidism with a capital chet. What is that? Going back at least as far as the Middle Ages, the group called Hasidei Ashkenaz, the pietists of Ashkenaz, Germany, we have groups of Jewish pietists who emphasize ethical behavior, who engage in mysticism, and who are ascetics. They fast, they flagellate themselves, they punish themselves as a way of getting rid of the body, the corporeal, and freeing themselves to be only spiritual. And these groups rise and fall through the history of the late Middle Ages and the early modern period. In the 18th century in Poland, this group enjoyed a kind of renaissance. And sources we have say that the avant-garde, the spiritual avant-garde of the Jewish community in Poland in the first half of the 18th century was made up of this type of mystical, ascetic Hasid. And so Zev Kitzis and David Purkis, the men that didn't want to accept the Baal Shem Tov in Międzybuż, were this kind of mystical, ascetic, let's call them old-style Hasidim. Now, when I was a child, and people talked about the Baal Shem Tov and the town of Międzybuż or Mezhibuž, they always gave you the impression that the Baal Shem Tov put Mezhibuž on the map. So first of all, here's where it is on the map, in Podolia, in South Ukraine. But today, if you go to Mezhibuž, the fact is the only people who go to Mezhibuž who don't live there are people who go there because of the Baal Shem Tov. In fact, in the mid-90s, the Ukrainian government wanted to make it into a tourist attraction. And they wanted to build a hotel and an airport, sort of what they have in Uman for Nachman of Bratslav. Well, it didn't work out. But like governments do, the first thing they did was to put up a sign. And they put up a sign that said, "Welcome to Międzybuż, home of Israel Baal Shem Tov, founder of Judaism." Well, the fact is that while today people go to Międzybuż because of the Baal Shem Tov, in the 18th century, it was already on the map. If you can see here that there are two rivers, there are two rivers that meet at Międzybuż, and there is a gigantic fortress controlling the traffic on the two rivers. So Międzybuż was a very important place. It was one of the 15 largest Jewish communities in Poland, Lithuania at the time. So it's not that the Baal Shem Tov put it on the map, it's that he went there because it was an important place, because it was a place where a young man could make a name for himself, perhaps even some money. Okay, how would you Google someone in the 18th century? Who will always know where you are? whether it's the 10th century or the 18th century or the 21st century. Someone will always know who you are. Who is that? Right. The tax man. Now, what you have here is a list of people who paid the chinch tax, a kind of real estate tax, in the town of Menzibuzh in 1760. So we have a list of the Jews who paid the tax. And you'll see in house number 93, we have Baal Shem Dr. Lieber. Dr. Baal Shem, exempt from tax. What does this tell us? First of all, why doctor? Because that's what a Baal Shem or a Baal Shem Tov was, a healer, a folk healer. A Baal Shem Tov was somebody who helped people with their problems, physical problems and other kinds of problems. He was a kind of shaman who bridged our world with the divine world. So he wrote amulets, he made potions for people who were sick, might drink. He advised people, he told stories to them. So he was a kind of doctor. And it's interesting that the house he lived in was exempt because this house in 1739 was occupied by a man named Moshe Duchovny, somebody who dealt with religious matters. Not a rabbi. If he was a rabbi, he would be rabbin. But he was perhaps a cantor, perhaps a teacher, a preacher. Well, Moshe left in 1739. In 1740, a new guy was in the house, Dom Kahalski Su Kantorsky. So perhaps it was always the cantor's house. But now we have a new person. We don't know his name yet. That is, the tax collector didn't know his name yet. But he knew what he did. He was a Kabbalista, a person who dealt in Kabbalah, in mysticism. And as time went on, we have Baal Shem Vdomu Kahalskim, Baal Shem Dr. Lieber. Now we know that in 1760 the Baal Shem Tov died. In 1763 we have Hirsch. And the Baal Shem Tov's son was Hirsch, perhaps this is his son, who took over the house when the Baal Shem Tov died. Now this is the Kahal's house. That means it is tax exempt, as we saw in the tax register. So think about that for a second. It means that unlike what you may read in various places, the Baal Shem Tov was not a rebel against the establishment. Quite the contrary. He was part of the establishment. He's supported by the establishment. They give him a house to live in, rent-free and tax-free. He is appointed as the official Baal Shem of Menzibuzh. He's like the doctor of the town. Now, they didn't give him a salary. He was paid by the people for whom he wrote the amulets or gave the potion or gave the advice, but he is in an official establishment-supported position. Now, what about his doctrines, his Torah? What is new about what the Baal Shem Tov taught? Well, we have a few things we can talk about. First of all, he's against asceticism. He wants chasydyzm, pietism, without asceticism. He says God doesn't want you to suffer. God doesn't want you to punish yourself. God wants you to have joy, not a wild kind of joy, but the joy of mitzvah, the joy of fulfilling the commandments of the Torah. So don't fast every day. Don't flagellate yourself. Think about God. Observe the mitzvot. Be confident. Be happy in the knowledge that you are doing God's will. Also, in order to commune with God, you don't have to be a super scholar. What's important is the letters of the holy text. The holiness resides inside the letters. There's a Hasidic Devar Torah that says, if you were to take all the letters of the Torah, throw them up in the air, and then they come down again, obviously in a much different order, they would still be just as holy. The point being is that the words are not the essence. The letters, the very letters are the essence. And if you can get inside the letters, if you can attach yourself to the holiness of the letters, you will be communing with God. Well, that means anybody can do it. You don't have to be somebody who sits in a yeshiva for 10 years in order to get to that holiness. Now, you might be thinking about sex, and that's supposedly bad. Baal Shem Tov said, you know what? That's okay if you're thinking about sex, because keep thinking about it, and you will come to the realization that sex is a blessing from God. Sex is a way of creating new life. Sex leads to the perpetuation of society, of culture, of Judaism, of mitzvot. Sex is wonderful if used in the proper way. So he believed that if we have sinful thoughts, they can be elevated. He also said, the story about the monk who goes to his abbot and says, is it permitted to smoke while praying? And the abbot says, well, of course not. You can't smoke while you're praying. He says, oh, okay. And he comes back and says, well, tell me, can I pray while smoking? Well, of course. And that is what the Baal Shem Tov was advocating. That is, any act, sex, eating, changing a tire, any physical act can become a way of worshiping God if it's done with the proper intent. You don't have to sit all day studying. You don't have to sit all day in the synagogue. Go about your life. What we might call a kind of religious mindfulness is what is required of you. And then he also said, don't just start praying off the bat. You've got to get in the right mood. You have to be in the right frame of mind. And so he advocated kavanot, kind of meditations that you should say before you actually pray, to make sure that your prayer is proper, and that not that you come into the synagogue and you say, okay, let's go. No. First, kavanot. And then you'll say Ashrei the right way. Okay, so this is a taste of what the Baal Shem Tov had to teach. But now let's talk about what the Baal Shem Tov was not and did not do. First of all, he did not have a dvor, a court, as later Hasidic Rebbes had. He had a chavura, a circle of people close to him. You can call them his disciples, people like Zev Kitsis and David Purkis, who eventually did accept him as a leader, and he was evidently the head of the Beit Midrash, the study hall of the Hasidim, of the old-style Hasidim in Mienzibuj. But we're talking about a handful of people, 5, 10 people. So he had a circle. He did not have a court with thousands of people coming to visit him. So he didn't have, as you will read in many places, 10,000 Hasidim by the time he died. There are, in the tax rolls of Mienzibuj, there are 5 people who are identified as Baal Shema, that is, of the Baal Shem, connected to the Baal Shem. So he certainly was a prominent person if even 5 people were identified as being connected to him. But he didn't have a movement of thousands of people around him. He created no new institutions, as I mentioned before. He was a Baal Shem, which was an accepted role in Jewish communities all over the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. He operated out of a synagogue and a Beit Midrash, a study hall. These are established institutions. He created no new institutions. He also wrote virtually nothing. All we have from him are 4 letters that he wrote. But he wrote no kind of theological tracts, no ideological writings, no writing. And he did not propound any kind of agenda, any kind of program. In other words, there is no movement. You cannot say that the Baal Shem Tov actually started a movement in our modern sense, which really comes from 19th century use of the word. He did not start a movement in the 19th century sense. I think if you had asked him, what is it that you're doing? He would say, I'm not changing Judaism, I'm changing chasydyzm, from that old style that Zev Kitsis and David Purkis were practicing, to something new, centered around the ideas that we mentioned before. Dov Ber, the Maggid of Mezerich in Yiddish, or Menzhezhech in Polish, Maggid means preacher, was a disciple of the Baal Shem Tov, and he began to transition. He started a new kind of institution. He went from the chavura, the circle of close disciples, to a dvor, a chatzer, a court. That is a place where his followers would gather. It was not the communal synagogue, not the communal Beit Midrash, but his home with more than one building. And unlike the pietistic, old-style, mystical, ascetic Hasidim, he was open to anybody who wanted to come. He even sent out emissaries to recruit people to come to his court. So we have a new dedicated institution dedicated to the tzaddik or the rebbe or the admor. All those terms refer to the leader of this court, of this chatzer. And the first one that we really know of is Dov Ber, the Maggid of Mezerich. So now we have a new institution, the chatzer. Dov Ber also made sure that there were ways of supporting this chatzer. It says in the Talmud, if there's no flour, there's no Torah. If there's no Torah, there's no flour. Well, flour means money, bread. If you're going to have a chatzer, you need a way to support it. And Dov Ber came up with a financial scheme, a way in which whoever came to the chatzer would contribute to its support. So Dov Ber started his chatzer and shaped the role of the tzaddik. First of all, there's a hierarchy. The closer you are to the tzaddik, the more important you are. Sort of like the White House. If the closer your office is to the president, the more important you are. Well, the same thing. The more face time you have with the tzaddik, the more important you are. Second, pilgrimage. Rather than the tzaddik going around to other people, people flocked to him. Next, yechidis. Rozmove poufna, that is, private interviews between the tzaddik and his individual followers, people who had problems and needed him to give them advice, to direct them, to guide them. And various rituals, as we'll see in a moment, that the tzaddik invented, and the way he taught. If the Baal Shem Tov taught through stories, he told stories to people, the Maggid taught via drashot, that is, sermons. And here we have an example. In the 18th century, there was a Polish Jew by the name of Shlomo Maimon, Solomon Maimon. I could give a lecture just about him. As a youth, teenager, he was already married, he had children, but he was on a spiritual quest. And he met two young men who were emissaries of the Maggid of Mezerich, who told him about the Maggid and his court, and he got very excited and decided to spend Shabbat there. And so he went to visit. And he describes what he experienced there. We don't have time to go through the whole description, but I just want to give you a taste. Shabbat, przybyłem na wspaniałą ucztę. W domu tzadika zgromadziła się grupa znamienitych osób z różnych zakątków. Następnie sam tzadik pojawił się w całej swej chwale. Ubrany był w biały aksamit. Na nogach miał białe ciewiki. Nawet jego tabiekiera była biała. Not bad for Chicago. Powitawszy gości, zasiadła z nami do stołu. W trakcie całego posiłku panowała święta cisza. Następnie tzadik zaczął śpiewać wesołą melodię. Kontemplując, wzniósł rękę ku skroni. A ritual, right? He's going like this. Together with the white, another ritual, wearing white from head to toe. Even his snuff bag was white. Następnie nazwał każdego gościa po imieniu, mówiąc skąd pochodzi. Byliśmy pełni podziwu. We were amazed. Why were they amazed? Because this tzaddik took an interest in each and every person. He acknowledged everyone individually. And a part that we're not going to read, he said Torah for each person, addressing whatever that person had in his heart. So this is a new kind of religious leader in the 18th century, somebody who's much more concerned with the individual than with the rules. Not that he wasn't concerned with the rules, he was. But on top of that, what do I have to say to the individual coming to me? But also here, let's note what we don't have. We don't have crises. People like Shlomo Maimon, who came to the Chatzer of the Maggid, don't go home and their parents throw them out of the house. Oh, you went to see the Maggid? That's nice. There's no crisis here. There is no new canon of holy books. At this stage, the Hasidim of the Maggid and other groups like his are completely using the standard library. We have no new doctrines yet. There is no organized communication among the various groups of Hasidim. There is no new code of behavior. What should a Hasid do? And there is no overall organization. Most of all, what is lacking is a self-conscious identity that we are a group, we are a distinct group, we're something different. They don't feel that way in the 1760s. They are inne, they are another, but they are not opsi, they are not the other. They are another way to be a pietist. And nobody gets too excited about it. Okay. You can do it that way too. until 1771-72, the winter of 1771-72, in the town of Skąd, another one of these groups, led by one of the disciples of the Maggid, Avraham of Kalisk, some of his disciples start behaving in rather unacceptable ways. They, during prayers, they do somersaults and stand on their heads, which is considered something terribly immodest, especially since it can reveal their underclothes. They mocked scholars as being too concerned with minutiae of law. And somebody preached a sermon in which he offered an interpretation of the Zohar, the main mystical book of Judaism, which some people at least interpreted as heretical. When the news of this unacceptable behavior reached this man, Eliyahu, the Gaon of Vilna, the Vilna Gaon, one of the rabbinic all-stars on the all-star rabbinic team of all times, who have obviously lived in Vilna. When he heard about this, he said, okay, that's it. From now on, these people are not another, they are the other. They've crossed the line. They're no longer in the tent. They are the other. He said, they call themselves chassidim. Now, the Gaon himself was called chassid. He was called Gaon v'chassid. Gaon meaning a scholar, a genius scholar. And chassid, what kind of chassid? The old kind of chassid, like Zev Kitsis and David Purkis were. The kind of chassid that was an ascetic and a mystic. That's the kind of chassid that you have to study for years to be. You have to practice. These people, he said, are not chassidim. They're mit chassidim. They're pretend chassidim. They're pretending to be chassidim. They're not real chassidim. And he said, they are a sect. And in Judaism, to be called a sect is very bad. They're out. They're not part of the mainstream. They're not kosher. Well, this attitude of the Gaon spread throughout eastern Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, and a book called Zamir Aritzim Vecharvot Surim was published very quickly in 1772, which included bans, charamot, bans that were declared against Hasidim in many different towns. And what did these bans, these charamot, cherem, singular, plural, charamot, the ban, what did they say about the Hasidim? What did they accuse the Hasidim of doing, these other people? First of all, they used the Lurianic prayer book, the Lurianic Sidur, and not the standard Ashkenazic Sidur prayer book. They prayed at unconventional hours. They would pray very late, when some authorities would have said the time has passed, it's too late for the morning prayer, or too late for the afternoon prayer. It's already nighttime. They didn't care. They used especially sharpened knives for ritual slaughter of animals to eat, unlike the standard Ashkenazic knife. This is a very complicated subject we can't get into now, but suffice it to say, this raises the whole question of, is it kosher? I mean, everybody likes to eat. If you're not using the right knife to slaughter the animal, then it's not kosher. So this really draws the line. Whose side are you on? If the Hasidim are using an unacceptable knife, then we can't eat their meat. On the other hand, the Hasidim will say, if you don't use our knife, we're not going to eat your meat. So this is a very serious issue. They are accused of being too punctilious about ritual purity, that is, going to the mikveh constantly, and praying in an ecstatic way, jumping up and down, starting in that corner, finishing in this corner, yelling and screaming ecstatic prayer, considered to be fake. And according to the accusations, Hasidim would never miss an opportunity to have a party. They liked to drink. They liked to sing and dance. And that was considered rather irrelevant to people who are trying to be pietists. And once again, they did not show the proper respect to scholars like the Vilna Gaon. Their gestures, their dress, their enthusiasm were all considered to be disrespectful, immodest, improper. They're also called Sabbatians, like Shabtai Tzvi, the false Messiah. They were considered to be followers of Shabtai Tzvi, who of course had died in 1675, almost 100 years earlier, or Frankists. The Frankists were the 18th century heirs to Sabbatianism. So they are accused of all these things, but note what they're not accused of. Despite the fact that they're accused of being Sabbatian, what are they not accused of? They're not accused of any ideological or institutional sins. The Chatzer is not criticized as something that's improper, and nothing about what they believe as being heretical. They are criticized for their behavior, not for their beliefs. And you know why? Because their beliefs were completely conventional. There was nothing to criticize. What is the reaction of the Hasidim to this opposition? Well, the Magid sent two of his disciples, Shneir Zalman of Ladi, the founder of Chabad Hasidism, and Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk, to the Gaon in Vilna to try to explain to him, look, we're just another, we're not the other. Well, the Gaon refused to see them. He wouldn't even let them in the house. The Magid then convened a kind of convention of his disciples in his home in Ruvna to consider what they should do. And this really is the first concrete sign of a kind of group identity. Yes, we are a defined, distinct group. We are distinct from those other people who eventually were called mitnagdim, that is, opponents. And interesting that they were defined as the other vis-a-vis Hasidim. There's Hasidim, that's a positive identification, and the mitnagdim are identified as being opposed. To whom? To the Hasidim. So, at the very end of his life, the Magid died in December of 1772. At the very end of his life, Hasidism begins to take on an identity as a real group. And they begin experimenting. What does it mean to be an identified group? What does it mean to be a distinct stream within Judaism? So the first thing is, how should our various groups be organized? And there were different models that were tried out in the 1770s, 1780s, 1790s, all the way till the first decade of the 19th century. There was the model of an elite circle, like the old-style Hasidim, that didn't admit just anybody, but you had to be learned. There was a model of the court, the circle or the court, would dissolve once the leader died. When the Baal Shem Tov died, whoever was around him went somewhere else. When the Maggid died, his disciples dispersed. They didn't keep the group going. They didn't appoint a new leader. Then there was what's called the royal style, as we see in Israel of Ruzhin, his father, Shalom Shachna, that is, the Rebbe who lives like a king, who has a carriage with 6 horses, who eats the best food, wears the best clothes. And why is that? Because it reflects his spiritual standing. Because he is a spiritual nobility, so he lives as a material noble. Then there are leaders without a court at all. You've all heard of Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, famous for his love of the people of Israel, many stories about him. He was a rabbi of various communities. He never was the head of a Hasidic court, even though he was a Hasid. Or we have the attempt to conduct the court from long distance. Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk and Abraham of Kalisk, who we met before, they both traveled to the land of Israel and tried to keep control of their Hasidim back in Lithuania via letters. They didn't have Skype. It didn't work. Then we have the model of Ruzhin, Saragura, and Chernobyl of a main court and branches, so that if you have 8 children, like the Chernobyl Rebbe did, they can go out and each one start a sub-court, still connected to the main court. Then we have courts that start and then die out, like the famous Elimelech of Lizhensk. His court did not survive his son. And then we have a court that the Hasidim stay together, but they never appoint a new leader, at least not officially. And of course, the most famous example is Nachman of Bratslav, where his Hasidim, when he died, said, okay, we're not dispersing. We're going to stay together. That's what was new. That was their innovation. But we're not replacing the Rebbe. Then we have leadership that is inherited by a disciple, as the example of Shlomo of Karlin, who inherited the leadership of Karlin Hasidim, who was a student. And then we have the example of the son who inherits the leadership, as the example of Dov Ber, the son of Shneur Zalman of Ladi, who was the second Rebbe of Chabad. You know, there's a saying that Hasidic Rebbes pray for daughters and not sons. And why is that? Because you can choose a son-in-law, you can't choose a son. Now, there are issues, and I hope that Zagadnienia is a good translation for issues, that Hasidism of the 80s, 90s, and early 19th century is dealing with, in addition to what to do when the Rebbe dies. Should membership be limited, or should it be open? Should the court disperse when the Rebbe dies, or should it continue? Should leadership be inherited by the student or by the son or son-in-law? How should we finance this movement? What should be the relationship between the Hasid and the Tzaddik? And what about women? Can women be Hasidim? Can women participate? Can women have interviews with the Rebbe? And in order to keep perpetuating this group, we're going to have to write something down. We need a literary canon that expresses what we stand for. So, is the Rebbe a commander or an advisor? Does he tell you how to live, or does he help you with your problems? Should prayer be normal, conventional, or should it be ecstatic, as we were talking about before? Should the Rebbe live modestly, or should he live like a king? Should teaching be done, as the Baal Shem Tov did, with folksy stories, or should it be done through drashot, or perhaps formal lessons? And what should the relationship be between words and music? Now, Hasidism was often portrayed from the 19th century on as an anti-modernist movement. Hasidism is trying to turn back the clock. Hasidism is trying to get us back to the Middle Ages. Hasidism is denying modernity. I disagree. I think Hasidism is very much a modern Jewish movement, and probably the most successful modern Jewish movement. Let me try to convince you. First of all, as a modern movement, it did, beginning in the 1780s, create a canon of literature that could be distributed and taught so people would know what it means to be a Hasid. Secondly, they framed what Hasidism is all about. They said, what is this? What are we doing? What is it that we're doing? What makes it legitimate? They're calling us a sect, a kat. We're not a sect. We're not Sabbatians. What is it that we are doing that makes us really legitimate Jewishly? And the answer was, Kabbalah had declined. Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, was forgotten. Kabbalah was neglected until the Baal Shem Tov came along. The Baal Shem Tov revived the real Kabbalah. And this was continued by his disciples, by Dov Ber of Mezerich, and the others. So what Hasidism is a renaissance of Kabbalah. And that's why it's legitimate. So they have a frame from which to appeal to people. They also, like a modern movement, invent new sources of authority. In the traditional Polish Jewish community, you had the Parnasim, the lay leaders of the community. Their authority was based on a tradition and what we might call a social contract. You had the rabbi. His authority was based on his learning. In Hasidism, you have a new kind of authority based on charisma, like we saw with Dov Ber and the way he related to people. You also have new manifestations of authority. The Rebbe in his court is a new place where there's Jewish authority now. It's a new place for Jews to go to for guidance. And we have new politics. In the traditional Jewish community, there was always a shtadlan, a lobbyist, who was paid by the community to lobby the Polish authorities on whatever issue might be. Lower the taxes, give us permission to build a synagogue, whatever it might be. There was an official lobbyist who tried to negotiate. And of course, I don't want to shock you, but they might even pay bribes to get their way. Well, we have a new politics now. The Rebbe negotiates. The Rebbe has contacts with the non-Jewish authorities. And he has strength because he can deliver. He has his followers. If he makes a decision, if he makes a commitment, he's got all these people who can back him up, who will do what he says. And new economy. The traditional Jewish community was supported by taxation. The Rebbe's court is supported by voluntary contributions. And in general, Hasidism is a classic, modern, voluntary organization. It is typified by a central headquarters and far-flung chapters in many different areas that feel some kind of loyalty to the central headquarters with occasional, what we could call in modern parlance, conventions. That is, all the followers gather at the Rebbe's court. That's a very modern kind of model of a voluntary organization. The traditional Jewish community, if you lived in a place, you were forced to be a member of the community. You were forced to obey the community. Nobody forces you to become a chassid. Nobody forces you to obey the Rebbe. Nobody forces you to pay him money. So this is a very new and modern concept. So, as the 19th century goes on, the number of Hasidim multiplies in Eastern Europe exponentially. From these small circles around the Baal Shem Tov in the 1740s and 50s, and around the Maggid and others in the 1760s, we get to thousands and tens of thousands of Hasidim by the time we're at the middle of the 19th century. We have geographic spread all over Eastern Europe. The Hasidim gain political influence. We can see, for example, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in Galicia. The Hasidim are much more powerful than the Maskilim, the enlightened ones, because the Hasidim represent the masses. And the Austrian authorities are much more inclined to cooperate with the Hasidim than with the liberals. And so, Hasidim find the way to preserve and perpetuate their movement. So it is a kind of modernization. It's been called defensive modernization. That is, using the tools of modernity to try to preserve a traditional way of life. But of course, there's no going home. That is, once you start using the tools of modernity, you become modern. They also accumulate economic power. And so I would say that Hasidism is really a movement of the 19th century. Scholars traditionally claimed that the classic Hasidism was the 18th century. That's when Hasidism reached its peak. And in the 19th century, it was degenerating. I don't think so. In the 18th century, Hasidism was developing. As you heard, I claim until the early 1770s, they didn't even think of themselves as some kind of distinct group, certainly not a movement. When does it become a movement? With numbers, with influence, with economic resources, with presence. When does that happen? In the 19th century. So I would submit Hasidism is really a movement of the 19th century. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm ready for the attack. Questions, comments?
Moshe, first of all, thank you for a marvelous lecture. I want to know
I don't
more.
see you. Where are you?
I'm right over here on your left.
Okay.
Okay, I want to know more about women in Hasidism. Can a woman be a Hasid?
Okay, I'm afraid that until the 20th century, with Chabad, the answer is no. Hasidic sources talk about wife of the Hasid, daughter of the Hasid, but women are not actually Hasidim. You can think of Hasidism not as a sect, but as a kind of chavura or confraternity. This is an idea of Professor Marcin Wojcinski of Wrocław, that it is a voluntary group of men who come together to practice whatever they practice. Their wives, of course, are supportive, but they are not actually part of the group until the 20th century, when, beginning with Chabad, women are drawn in, beginning in the 1930s, really, or 20s even, into the group. Now, it is true that you have powerful women in Hasidism. The most typical way a woman becomes powerful is if the Rebbe dies relatively young and leaves his son, who is to be the heir, as a child or a teenager. His mother becomes the power. So while in name the child is the Rebbe, really the widow of the Rebbe yields power and is the one that controls the court. And this is a fairly common phenomenon. But strictly speaking, women are not really Hasidim. Yes?
I have a question about two terms. Is today the term Orthodox does it include Hasidism or does it mean the same?
Please.
And the other, yes, the question is, today we can talk about the Orthodox Jews. Do they include Hasidism? That's the question number one. Number two is, where do you place Lubavitcher?
Okay. So, loosely speaking, Hasidim are usually classed with what's called in Israel Haredim, or outside of Israel, ultra-Orthodox, as opposed to modern Orthodox. Hasidim are in the Haredi, or ultra-Orthodox camp. Certainly in Israel, politically speaking, if you go by the political parties, so the Haredi parties, a large proportion of them is made up of Hasidim, the people who vote for those parties. So I would say that they would class themselves with Haredim, or at least what used to be called ultra-Orthodox. I have the sense that that term is going out of vogue, but so that's... Oh, yeah, well, Lubavitch are part of that, but they also are known for their outreach, so that while within they are certainly ultra-Orthodox, many of their synagogues that their shluchim, their emissaries established throughout the world, are extremely accepting and liberal. While the ritual there is Orthodox, they're very tolerant of all sorts of variants of Jewish practice on the part of other people. So they're accepting of others, but they themselves would consider themselves the Haredi.
I would like to ask something more about the traditional outfits.
Traditional
Outfits of the Jewish religious about the how they dress actually.
Oh yes, dress. Okay.
Yeah, because I remember that in Jerusalem you can see some religious men walking in fur hats and that kind of outfits.
Okay, this is a very complex question.
All right.
When I was young, the standard answer was they adopted the dress of the Polish nobility. Well, that's partially true. There are some Hasidic groups who look like they're wearing the kantush and the streimel. I don't know what the Polish word is for it. That certain noblemen would have worn in the 18th century. On the other hand, many Hasidic groups, they're wearing basically 19th century dress. They're dressed like mid-19th century politicians. So the point of Hasidic dress is that the outside is supposed to reflect the inside. The way you're dressed is supposed to show who you are in your soul, which means that every part of your dress has significance because it shows which Rebbe you're attached to. So if your coat is double vented or single vented, if it buttons on the left or the right, all of these things, the shape of your hat, everything has significance showing to whom you belong. As far as where the dress comes from, it comes from different places, as what I just said implies. You have some dress that's 18th century, some that's 19th century. Also, we have to keep in mind that, I forget the exact date now, around 1840, the Russians outlawed so-called Jewish dress and said Jews had to dress either like Poles or Russians or Germans. And so many Jews said, okay, we're going to dress like Russian merchants who happen to wear streimels and long coats. So that's also a factor in what was considered Jewish dress.
Thank you, Professor. Many questions, but one I would highlight that comes to my mind. Are these Hasidis from the 19th century significant in kind of ideological way that they are dealing with the history? You know, like that they are so, because you said that they attract more, that they become more attractive than liberals at one side.
I said Chabad.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
but that's a 20th century phenomenon, not 19th century.
Mm-hmm. But do they deal with the history of the Judaism in some special way, that they raise the questions on history in a way that were not raised before?
Well, for some Hasidic groups, history is very important. For Chabad, they have a lot of historical research and historical writing. Karlin, there's a famous archive that was discovered for Karlin Hasidism, and they publish a historical journal. So there are some Hasidim that are very concerned about history, and there are some that say, you know, we know all the history we need to know from the tradition. So there are various ways. Now, of course, what they do and what someone like me does when it comes to history is sometimes meets, but often very different, in that they use only Jewish sources, by and large, and the way the sources are analyzed is much different. I mean, you know, what holds the university together, what is common to every department in the university, whether it's physics or literature or anthropology, whatever it is criticism. Criticism is the coin of academia. And with any fundamentalist group, there is some kind of limit on criticism.
I would like to ask about Hasidic dance. Could you say some words about it?
About what?
About Hasidic dance. What
Dance.
was dance? Yes.
No, I don't know anything about it.
What was the most important?
I'm sorry.
In Hasidic? Nothing.
I have nothing to say about it. I'm Am Haaretz. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Please stand up.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Rosman, for this wonderful lecture. And speaking of criticism, I'd like to challenge.
Talk louder.
I'd like to challenge you, speaking of
Please.
criticism. So I'd like to know your opinion on the inspiring power or maybe influence of the Christian mysticism for the Hasidic movement. Hasidism didn't develop in vain. They were surrounded by Christians, their religiosity expressions and so forth. Do you think there was any kind of inspiration?
Okay, this is one of the standard questions. There are people here from Norway, right? In the 1930s, a scholar named Thorsten Isander wrote a book claiming that Hasidism was, quote unquote, influenced by Russian dissenting sects. And ever since, there have been numerous attempts to show that Russian schismatic sects, and one of the most recent attempts was now Romanian mystical sects, influenced the Baal Shem Tov and Hasidism. Some of these, well, I'll put it this way, no one has yet shown any actual contact between the Baal Shem Tov and any Christian figure. No one has shown any material, quote unquote, influence on Christian groups, from Christian groups on Hasidism. Everything that has been written is either speculative or completely mistaken. And if we had time, I could give you the examples. However, I don't like the word influence at all when we talk about history. I talk about a shared band of culture. A shared band of culture. What do I mean? Groups that on a conscious level are alien to each other, might even be antagonistic to each other, but who live in the same environment, share culture at what we could call the magmatic level, that is the unconscious level. Let's take gender. What are the proper gender roles? That's common to everybody who lives in a certain environment. Or what's considered immodest? What the Hasidim were criticized for as being immodest. That was common to everybody. What is the proper role of political leaders? In the 17th, 18th century, political leaders weren't considered to be representative of the people. They were guardians of the people. Jews believe that, Christians believe that. So there is a shared band of culture, no question about it. But direct influence has yet to be proven. Are you shocked?
I've got another question about the Baal Shem Tov and his figure. You said that he was the healer and really really who had a special power, mystical power. Does it mean that he was really curing people who was coming to him? Like we can remember the figure of Jesus in the Bible, that he was coming and curing everybody and so forth and so forth. Is that kind of figure in the community?
Not quite. In the Vernadsky Library in Kiev, there's a book called Sefer HaCheshek, a manuscript, a 400-page manuscript called Sefer HaCheshek, which means the book of desire. Don't get excited. We're talking about desire for God. This book was written by a man named Hillel Baal Shem, who lived a little north of where the Baal Shem Tov lived in the same years that the Baal Shem Tov was living. He wrote this book around 1740. That's the year the Baal Shem Tov came to Medjugorje. So Hillel Baal Shem wrote this book, which contains, it's like, a physician's desk reference. This is the Baal Shem's desk reference. Here's the disease. Here's what you write in the amulet. Here's what you put in the potion. Here's the ritual that you perform. Somebody has a problem with their neighbor, here's what you tell them to do, or here's what you write in the amulet. It is a catalog of practices that Baal Shem is supposed to do, including exorcism, how to perform exorcism. And this Hillel Baal Shem says he wrote his book because he's trying to convince some community to give him the kind of position that our Baal Shem Tov had. He's itinerant, and he wants to be in a resident Baal Shem somewhere like Israel Baal Shem was. And so he's writing this book to prove that he has this knowledge, but he also says in several places, or he hints in several places, that he once performed an exorcism that went bad. He doesn't go into detail, obviously, but it seems like somebody died because of his exorcism. So, all this is just to say, whether you believe in faith healers or not, that's not my department. But there were many figures like this, again, also non-Jewish ones. That's another example of shared band of culture. We even know that Jews would go to the non-Jewish shamans, and non-Jews would go to the Jewish shamans.
Okay. Excuse me?
Yes,
Here?
I have another question.
But someone in the back who didn't ask yet. Yes. Speak up.
I would like to ask about the reception of Hasidism by Jewish thought, by Jewish philosophers, especially at the beginning of the 20th century. For example, Martin Buber, who published the Tales of Hasidim. I would actually like to ask for your personal opinion, because Buber's book is considered to be rather a cultural construct, a vision of Hasidism rather than historical source. What do you think about it?
Buber has gotten a bad rap. Buber is accused, as you just more than hinted, that he published these Hasidic stories, but he rewrote them. He took the original stories and he rewrote them. Well, that's unfair criticism, because he tells you in the beginning of the book that he's rewriting them. He's not pretending that these are the original stories. Buber tells you, I'm rewriting the story because I understand the true message of the story, and I'm rewriting it to let the true message get out. Well, of course, the true message means what was meaningful to Buber in 1905 or 1907. What he's looking at Hasidism for what it can say to modern man, and one of his books is Hasidism and Modern Man. But he's not dishonest about it. He's telling you, I'm translating Hasidism into the language that will be meaningful to modern people, to help them. And he began what can be called neo-Hasidism. Hasidism, which was expressed by non-Hasidim as a way into spirituality for Jews and other people as well. And this continued throughout the 20th century, and I think you could say that it segued into what's called now New Age Judaism. And in fact, some of the leading figures of New Age Judaism started out as Hasidim. So there is certainly a connection between those phenomena. But obviously, neo-Hasidism is not Hasidism. Otherwise, you wouldn't call it neo.
Hello, here.
Yes.
You said before that the importance of the rabbis was measured by their charisma. And I would
Of the Rebbes.
Yes,
Yes.
yes. And I would like to ask you to explain what do you mean by charisma? How to understand it? Thank you.
It means the power of in this context, I think it means the power of a person to inspire loyalty in others. Now, that could have many sources. I grant you, scholarship could also be a source of charisma. But it means that people are willing to go through a fire and brimstone for this person because of this quality that they have.
Yeah, I have a question. It's unclear to me now how Hasidism derives from Shbatai Tzvi and the pogroms of the Khmelnytsky uprising, the times of bloodbath.
I don't think it did derive from there.
The response as the spiritual
Yeah,
joy,
okay.
as an antidote to the terrible.
So,
times.
thank you, Shimon Dubnov.
Yes.
You just gave us Dubnov's theory of Hasidism. It's exactly what Dubnov said, and I'm always happy that Dubnov, who was murdered in 1940, that his Torah is still in the world. But I don't agree with it. Dubnov said that Hasidism was a response to the crisis of persecution that began with Khmelnytsky revolt and continued with what he called a frenzy of blood libel accusations in the first half of the 18th century. He said that the Jews were persecuted, they were depressed, they were melancholy, and so they turned to and that Hasidism is a response to that persecution. Well, 1648 was almost 100 years before 1740, when the Baal Shem Tov got to Menzibuj. And just to give you one statistic, the recovery from 1648 was very rapid, the physical recovery. Where does Hasidism flourish? Exactly in the places where the most people were killed in 1648. What does that tell you? They came back. They reconstructed their lives. They reconstructed their communities. It's not what happened after the Shoah. These communities came back to life. I mean, I have seen a record book from the town of Dubno in Volyn. It was attacked, but by 1651, the Jewish community is working again. Pinsk, by 1651, the Jewish community is working again with the same leaders that they had before 1648, which tells you that people who could afford to run away did run away and survived. So you can't pin this on 1648. And as far as the blood libels, it's not true that there were more blood libels in the first half of the 18th century than in the second half of the 17th century. So Hasidism is not a response to this kind of crisis. Shabtai Tzvi. Again, Shabtai Tzvi. The Shabtai Tzvi converted in 1666, 80 years before the things that we're talking about. So yes, there is Sabbatianism, very low flame, very small groups. The Baal Shem Tov, according to the stories in Shivchei HaBesh, was aware of Frankism, and he, according to the story, criticized the rabbis for how they responded to Frankism, because they encouraged, more than encouraged, the Frankists to convert to Christianity just to get rid of them, and he felt that this was wrong, but that's about as far as it goes. Okay, I think
last question.
our time is up.
Mine.
Last question, yes.
Yeah. I would like to ask you, we know that Hasidism developed in Eastern Europe, yeah? And you claim that it was quite a modern movement, or it used modern tools to develop. And what is your opinion? How Hasidism didn't develop in the Western Europe? First of all, in Prussia, in Germany, there were also quite many Jews there, and we didn't have
Well, I think
any
we get back
traces.
to our shared band of culture. It's a completely different environment, culturally, politically, economically. The forces at work were going in a different direction. And so in Western Europe, you have much more in the direction of enlightenment, reform. Jacob Katz wrote a famous book, Tradition in Crisis, in which he said that in the 18th century, the traditional Ashkenazic Jewish community was disrupted. In the East, in the West, the framework was broken, was destroyed by enlightenment, Haskalah, and assimilation, and reform. And in the East, the framework was distorted by Hasidism. Now, this is very much an oversimplification, but it's a place to start. And to say that the different environment in the West militated against Hasidism spreading, although eventually Hasidism did get as far as Central Europe, Hungary, even Germany. Again, Professor Wojcinski is publishing an atlas of Hasidism. And you see, certainly by the 20th century, Hasidism has reached quite far west.
Thank you very much. If you have another question, there will be a small discussion private here. Professor Moshe Rosmana is coming back today to Israel, so we don't have so much time for...
come to Israel.
Yeah, come to Israel to continue this discussion. Thank you very much.